Now you can go.
Oh, good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. Let's hope this year is better than last year and the year before. I'm competing with these large snowdrops. I'm feeling small. I just want to say, I have said it before, I know I said it last, just to reiterate the fact that it used to be 75% me and 25% Martin in the olden days of research, and now it's very much the other way around. It's 75% Martin and 25% me. Just want to sort of emphasise that Martin worked really, really hard on producing the notes. All I do is give him the written in my own fair hand. He finds the pictures and he does all the technology, and I just wanted to make that clear that I reckon it's 75 Martin and 25% me. So the reign of Queen Victoria, and the emphasis this time is on her husband, on the prince. Only called he's only called the Prince Consort for the last 4 years of his life. She worked really hard to get him that title much earlier on in the marriage, but there was opposition because he was foreign. There was real prejudice against Prince Albert, virtually until he died. And then when he died, people sort of rallied round and realised what a huge contribution he had made and how important he had been, not just to the Queen, but to the country. So that's what we're going to look at today. Well, to start anyway, the royal marriage. Now, to start with, Princess Victoria and then the Queen Victoria had resented the idea that the Coburg cousins were being pushed in her direction, because it had been a plan from the time that they were babies that she would marry her Coburg cousin, one or the other of them, Ernst or Albert. Fortunately, she didn't marry Ernst because he turned out to be like their father. He was promiscuous, bit of a rotter, really. Albert, the opposite. Prince Albert had been an interesting child, rather withdrawn, very intellectual, quiet, calm, but very sensitive. So he was the one that was being sort of forwarded. He was the one that was being groomed, if you like. But she didn't fancy him. He came over to this country when he was 16 with his brother, who was a little bit older. And unfortunately, Prince Albert had, we don't know what was wrong with his tummy, but he had a sensitive tummy, and he was horribly seasick. He really couldn't stand voyages at all. A kind of person that was sick when the ship was still in harbour. And just coming across the channel, he was horribly ill. And the princess, as she was then, described him as being green. He was also a little bit podgy. He was a little bit overweight, and obviously very quiet because he felt awful. He felt absolutely dreadful because he'd been so sick on the way over, and probably very nervous as well because he knew why he would run this country as a likely future consort for the princess. She was enjoying her freedom. We've described her strange upbringing, where she didn't have any freedom at all, and no choice in anything, not even choosing her own clothes. Her mother was living for her. So, in some ways, you could say she was very immature when she became queen, and yet she amazed everybody by taking to the role like a duck to water. And as soon as she did become queen, she realised that she had power. Although she was only 18 years old, she had power and authority, and she used it, as we've explained, to become independent almost overnight. Really an amazing transformation. She'd obviously been thinking about this for years before it actually happened. You know, someday I'll have my own way. And didn't she use this freedom? Yes, she did. She loved her independence. So she was actually very reluctant to surrender it. She actually said to Lord Melbourne, I don't want to get married because I'll have to obey my husband. I don't want to, I'm paraphrasing, I don't want to lose my independence, having finally gained it. And he totally understood. As usual, he sort of agreed with her and said, no, there's absolutely no pressure. Well, he didn't say that, I'm paraphrasing again. He didn't actually say no pressure, but that's what he meant. You're very young, you don't need to make your mind up straight away. But it is, we know because she kept a diary, she kept a journal. We know that after 3.5 years of not seeing him, when he came back with his brother for another visit, things had changed. He had changed. She hadn't actually. She was still determined to keep her freedom. But famously, as he came down, I'll just read the whole thing. It says, any rooms Victoria may have felt about Albert was swept away when the couple finally met again in October 1839 at Windsor Castle. Upon seeing him for the first time in almost 3.5 years, the young queen was amazed at the transformation. She was impressed by his character and morals. Diary revealed that she found the young prince, quote, so handsome and pleasing, adding, but the charm of his countenance is his expression, which is most delightful. Once together on the end of October, Victoria gave Albert a flower from her bouquet. Dressed in uniform that lacked a buttonhole, Albert cut a small hole in his jacket and placed the flower over his heart. The Queen was enchanted, and her journal entry for the day clearly conveys her infatuation. Now, that is a sort of charming, romantic gesture, just the kind of thing that would win her heart, because she'd been brought up reading what we would say were sort of Mills and Boon novels. She had a very romantic side to her nature. She loved operas and ballet, also romantic. And so cutting a hole in his uniform seems a kind of eccentric thing to do, but she was absolutely smitten at that point. What a wonderful romantic thing to do. And this is her famous diary entry. Albert really is quite charming and so excessively handsome. Such beautiful blue eyes, an exquisite nose, and such a pretty mouth with delicate mustachios and very slight whiskers, a beautiful figure, broad in the shoulders and a fine waist. My heart is quite going. It is quite a pleasure to look at Albert when he gallops and valses, those are two kinds of dances that are current at the time. He does it so beautifully, holds himself so well with that beautiful figure of his. And she's sort of breathless with sort of amazement and admiration, almost literally swept off her feet when she says, my heart is quite going. She's had a physical, powerful reaction to the prince. And then she wrote to her uncle Leopold. The dear cousins arrived at 7:30 on Thursday, after a very bad and almost dangerous passage. Ernest is so handsome. Albert's beauty is most striking, and he is so amiable and unaffected. In short, very fascinating. He is excessively admired here. She was wrong about that. We rode out yesterday, and after dinner, The young men are very amiable, delightful companions, and I'm very happy to have them here. They are playing some symphonies of Haydn under me at this very moment. They are passionately fond of music. Writing to her uncle in a very naive, innocent sort of way, like a much younger. She's 20 by this time, like somebody much younger. A mere 5 days after Albert's arrival in England, Victoria had no doubts about their mutual attraction and affection. As royal tradition dictated that no one could propose to a reigning monarch, Victoria had to ask Albert to marry her on the 15th of October 1839. The momentous occasion was duly recorded in her journal. At about half an hour past 12, I sent for Albert. He came to the closet where I was alone, and after a few minutes I said to him that I thought he must be aware why I wished him to come here, and that it would make me too happy if he would consent to what I wished, to marry me. We embraced each other over and over again, and he was so kind, so affectionate. I felt it was the happiest, brightest moment in my life. She wrote to her uncle Leopold later that same day to give him the news and disclose her desire to marry Albert as swiftly as possible. My dearest uncle, this letter will, I am sure, give you pleasure, for you have always shown and taken so warm in all that concerns me. My mind is quite made up, and I told Albert this morning of it. The warm affection he showed me on learning this gave me great pleasure. He seems perfection, and I think that I have the prospect of very great happiness before me. I love him more than I can say, and I shall do everything in my power to render the sacrifice he has made, for a sacrifice, in my opinion, it is, as small as I can. And so on, and so on. Leopold was no doubt absolutely delighted, because he was uncle to both Victoria and Arnold, and he'd been planning this for 20 years. So for him, it was a dream come true. Finally achieved what he'd been working towards. A union, an alliance, if you like, between Coburg, which is about the size of Warwickshire, and Great Britain, which of course had an overseas empire and was a very infantry. So this was an absolute triumph for the people who'd been working diligently to this end, an alliance between Coburg and Great Britain. So this was a true love match. People have often asked over the years, did Prince Albert reciprocate the Queen's passionate feelings for him? Did he love her, in other words? And the answer, after a lot of research and reading his letters, his letters and his letters to other people, the answer is yes. In a much more restrained way, he did love the Queen. So the 10th of February, some people thought it was a strange decision to get married in winter, but as I've already pointed out, well, as she pointed out herself, she didn't want to wait. Now she's full of enthusiasm for marriage. So the royal wedding took place. It was a very popular occasion. Thousands of people came to London to sort of try and catch a glimpse of the bride and groom. And some old traditions were ignored, interestingly. First of all, the service took place in daytime at 1 p.m. Royal marriages usually took place at night, not in the middle of the night, but in the evening. The bride wore white. People think that brides have always worn white. Well, no, they haven't. Queen Victoria actually introduced the idea. The bride normally just wore her best dress. Sometimes had the dress made, but it wasn't white. It was a sort of ball dress, really, a posh dress, but not white. White was associated with childhood. But the Queen wanted, well, White is also associated with virginity, and she chose her own dress with great delight, of course, because she'd always had her dresses chosen for her. So this was another way of her showing her independence, and the fact that it was trimmed with, she chose the trimmings, and she chose, as I say, to wear white, which then, of course, was a great, everybody wanted to copy her, and white fabrics became the in thing for weddings, and people have copied that ever since. So she'd started a trend. Also, that it was an arranged marriage, but that there's no doubt that the couple loved each other, and they had met before. Whereas previous royal weddings, often the bride had turned up only a few days previous to the wedding. And the couple didn't know each other and often didn't even speak each other's language. So it was different. They did know each other. They'd been pen friends. They'd been writing to one another. Another thing was that they had a very short honeymoon, and that was their first, not falling out, but disagreement. Well, not just royalty, but the people who could afford it, they sort of disappeared for about a fortnight. It wasn't considered seemly for a woman to appear in public during that time, because the marriage had been consummated, and it just wasn't considered right that she should appear in public. But the Queen, because she was the Queen, argued very forcefully that she couldn't be away from her desk, she couldn't be away from work, we'd say today, because the situation was different for her. And so this was their first disagreement. Well, there were several disagreements, all at the same time, really. He had brought advisors, and he brought his own entourage, not huge, but he brought Germans with him. And the Queen then said, well, no, that won't go down very well with my people. I've chosen your secretary, I've chosen your entourage. I'm afraid the Germans will have to go home. So that was you could say there were two disagreements that sort of coincided. First of all, he had to agree finally. Well, he didn't actually agree, but he had to submit to very powerful arguments that he couldn't have Germans around him. He got to have English people around him. Otherwise, there would be complaints that he was being influenced by his foreign entourage. I mean, she argued very powerfully, and it was a sensitive thing. She didn't seem to understand how he was going to be for the next few months, certainly. And also, which I'll now quote, the fact that he thought she should have the usual traditional honeymoon, that they should disappear for view for possibly 14 days, and she argued very powerfully that that wasn't possible. So this is the argument. So first of all, it's called his household, meaning the people who would be around him, entourage. And this is what Albert said: think of my position. I'm leaving my home with all its old associations, all my bosom friends, and going to a country in which everything is strange to me. Men, language, customs, modes of life. I have no one to confide in. It's a very sad letter. Is to be conceded. Is it not to be conceded that the 2 or 3 persons who are to have the charge of my private affairs should be persons who already command my confidence? Rather a pathetic plea to have some of his German friends, associates, people who work for him. Please, could he keep them? But Victoria remained unmoved and was firm in her written reply, underlining almost every word for emphasis. It is, as you rightly suppose, my greatest, my most anxious wish to do everything most agreeable to you, but I must differ with you respecting Mr. Anson. Now, that was the gentleman who the Queen had selected to be the Prince's private secretary. What I said about Anson giving you advice means that if you like to ask him, he can and will be of the greatest use to you, as he is a very well-informed person. I am distressed to tell you that what I fear you do not like, but is necessary, my dearest, most excellent Albert. Once more I tell you that you can perfectly rely on me in these matters. In other words, I've chosen the people that are going to be closest to you, and there isn't anything else to argue about. And then she wrote to, she talked it over with Lord Melbourne. Talked of Albert's not quite understanding about his household, which, however, I said I should make him easily understand. Don't let it stand in the way about George Anson, said Lord Melbourne kindly. But I said George Anson was the fit person and that I should easily make him understand it. So she's sort of ordering the prince around and implying that he doesn't understand he doesn't understand the situation, and she is going to explain it to him. And then the argument about the very short honeymoon. Says the pair also disagreed about the length of the honeymoon. Shortly before their wedding, on the 1st of January 1840, Victoria wrote to Albert from Buckingham Palace, explaining her position very clearly. You agreed to me in one of your last stay at Windsor, but, dear Albert, you have not at all understood the matter. You forget, my dearest love, that I am the sovereign, and that business can stop no way. Parliament is sitting, and something occurs almost every day, for which I may be required, and it is quite impossible for me to be absent from London. Therefore, 2 or 3 days is already a long time to be absent. And never easy a moment if I am not on the spot and see and hear what is going on. So, very firmly putting him in his place and implying that he just doesn't understand. Very patronizing, because in fact, he was very, very much more intelligent and much better educated than she was. So you can imagine this, that he was having to swallow his feelings and accept that he was under her command, that he was having to learn to do as he was told. It resonates with the information we've had recently about the Duke of Edinburgh. He was in very much the same position, having to accept the restrictions when his wife became the Queen. He would always have to walk several paces behind her. He would always have to bear in mind that she was the Queen as well as his wife. Prince Albert really had to do the same thing. And amazingly, of course, because he was speaking a second language, it was amazing how well he coped. So Rose already said he was much more intelligent and much better educated. He'd actually been to university. And he'd been encouraged to believe that if he married Princess Victoria, or how she became Queen, he would have a significant role to play. He'd been, you could say, been groomed for this role, helping to raise the reputation of the royal family, and it certainly needed improvement, and also the hidden agenda to introduce liberal ideas and social reform. Seems rather strange that the Germans were introducing this into Great Britain. Sounds, again, somewhat patronising, but that was something that the Prince and his advisors in Coburg felt very, very strongly about. And so he had an agenda. And shocked to discover very early on, within days of their marriage, that the Queen had no intention of sharing her power. And she very condescendingly allowed him to have the blotting paper, so that when she'd written something, he was allowed to step forward with the blotting paper and blot the ink. The sort of role a servant would have had. So she thought she was doing him a big favour, you know, allowing him even to glance at the document, even as he was putting the blotting paper on it. He was actually seeing very important state papers, but he wasn't allowed to have anything else to do with them. And she had a point when she argued that he was a foreigner. She had seen some of the cartoons, which we'll look at next time. She'd seen some of the cartoons which were hostile to the prince, even before they got married. And she was aware of the feelings of the people, that if Prince Albert was seen to be interfering in any way, that would go down like a lead balloon. But it clashed with his feelings that he was the man of the house, he was the husband, and he should have more authority. He desperately wanted to share the power, not because he was greedy for power, but he wanted to help her. He did feel very, very tip towards his little wife. I mean, she brought that out in a lot of people because she was so tiny and looked so young. And although he was actually 3 months younger than the Queen, he did have this feeling of wanting to protect her and help her in any way he could. And she was very much determined not to allow it, bearing in mind that she had been so controlled. She certainly wasn't going to let him have any power. And he did become quite depressed. He wrote to his brother in Coburg and said, I don't have any power or authority. Victoria is really quite stubborn about that, and I don't feel that I have any role to play. Remember probably Prince Philip saying, excuse the French, I'm just a bloody amoeba. So he was feeling exactly the same as Prince Albert, that he didn't have a role. Well, luckily for the prince and unluckily for the Queen, because she'd absolutely dreaded becoming pregnant, they didn't seem to do anything to prevent it. But so rather strange that she was so not strange that she was frightened of becoming pregnant. That's not strange, but they didn't seem to control it in any way. She was pregnant within weeks of marriage, probably within 3 weeks. The thing she dreaded, understandably, because she was very small. Probably thought she was going to have a difficult time, but also the ghost of Princess Charlotte sort of haunted the royal family. The fact that Princess Charlotte had died as a result of her labour, and her baby had died. You know, a double tragedy in 1817. So understandably, Queen Victoria was very afraid of being with child. But this was good for the prince, because she had morning sickness and she was unhappy. She couldn't keep up the work schedule, because she was, to be fair to Queen Victoria, very hard working, and she continued to be throughout her reign. She worked hard at her desk, as our present Queen does. She didn't neglect her duties. But this was an opportunity for the prince to kind of move in, because she was ill at the beginning of the pregnancy, and later ill as the pregnancy progressed. She got tired very easily. She milked this pregnancy. I haven't put this in the notes, but she really milked this pregnancy for all it was worth, because she was very unhappy about it. She sort of pretended to be more ill than she actually was. She was actually a very, very healthy woman and coped with her pregnancies amazingly well. But she was attention seeking and also very miserable about the pregnancy. So at first, the prince's role was caring for her, So she would ring her little bell when she finished working at her desk and she'd signed all the papers and read all the dispatches and done everything she was supposed to do. She would ring her bell. He would come rushing in, pick her up and carry her across to a chaise longue or a couch. She would and then put a blanket or a shawl over her. She would then have a rest. She would then ring her little bell and he would come scampering and carry her back to her desk. This went on all day. But he was quite happy about this because at least he was feeling very useful and she was depending on him. But she was really playing for the gallery. She didn't really need to be carried. She could have walked, but she preferred to appear to be sort of little and helpless. From his point of view, really well. Within 2 years, that seems a long time, but not really. Within 2 years, they had desks side by side, identical desks, and she was deferring to him more and more. The dispatches, the boxes came to her, she opened them and more or less handed them over to the prince. He then read them. She wasn't all that brilliant with very long words, but she didn't want to admit that. She didn't want to sit with a dictionary on her desk. Considering he was using his second language, shows how intelligent he was, he sort of interpreted the dispatches, the letters, or the notes from the Prime Minister. And then, having done that, he would draft a reply. And she would copy it out. She would copy it. I mean, that wasn't well known at the time, obviously. But that's how it ended up, that he was virtually doing the work and it was like role reversal. She was like a secretary, just copying out, making a fair copy. And there weren't any word process, there weren't any word process, or you could, somebody had to copy things out longhand, the fair copy, which a secretary normally did. So the prince was able to gain the authority that he wanted and to be useful. And he understood the British Constitution actually more than the Queen did. So she didn't need to be so patronising as she had been in the first weeks of their marriage, where she seemed implied that he didn't understand things. He understood very well indeed. So this was his chance to become important, and in fact became absolutely essential. And she recognised the fact, she did recognise the fact that she relied on him more and more. So they weren't quarrelling about that anymore. She recognised the fact that he was helping her enormously in her demanding, difficult role. And as she had a lot of pregnancies, 9 altogether, there were times when, unbeknown to the public, he was doing virtually all the work. She was signing things, and he was he read them all to her. He read everything. He didn't keep her in the dark, but she was very happy to let him do that, and then she would sign. And that worked really well. When he died, only 42 years old, it was recognised what not the details, but what a huge contribution he had made. And it was true that he had made this contribution. It was recognised, and 2 people actually referred to him as king. One of them being Disraeli. That to all intents and purposes, he was the king. And then somebody earlier in the commenting about it, Prince Albert, earlier in the reign, saying the same thing. What a loss to the country when he died. That's what Disraeli was saying. What a huge loss to the country that this man had been virtually unrecognised. The amount of hard work he'd done, not just supporting the Queen, but sort of working in a partnership, which is what he'd always wanted. He is remembered, of course, for the Great Exhibition, which was his brainchild. It was he sort of masterminded this this idea, this great idea of an exhibition to be held in this country, but inviting other countries to send items, really to show, it was sort of showcasing, it's called today, showcasing the skills and the availability of goods in other countries, but really emphasizing how far ahead we were in terms of technology and mechanization, etc. We were way ahead. Our industrial revolution, as you know, had taken place long before that of other countries. So the Prince felt confident that this would work really well, that we would be showing what we could do, inviting the other countries to take part. Yes, that was all part of this, the way the Prince had been brought up, to keep peace in Europe, to keep peace in the world by trade. A sort of new idea, free trade, rather than dramatic new idea. The old idea had been to protect our goods by putting very high customs duties, excise duties, on incoming foreign goods, to try and keep foreign goods out of this country. We would sell to other countries, and we would, for protectionism, we would protect our industry and our products by virtually stopping other countries from selling to us. You know, if we could make pottery, then we must buy our own home product and not buy French pottery, or well, pottery China, porcelain, which is why smugglers had such a brilliant time, such a brilliant time, smuggling in things that you weren't supposed to have, because they came from France, largely. But the new concept was free trade would create in Europe. That was the way the Prince had been brought up. That's what he learned at university. That trade, peaceful trading, resulted in peace between different states and countries. So the Prince had this idea that they would have this huge exhibition, and formed a group of like-minded people, and they worked very hard indeed to get this off the ground. Famously, where would they have this exhibition? It ought to be somewhere sort of easily available, but not an existing building. Partly because that would put that building out of commission for a while. So, and also that would probably be quite cramped to use an existing building. So they wanted the freedom to build something new. But the idea that it would be made of glass was absolutely revolutionary. You can imagine people saying, "Glass? Are you mad? What do you mean it's going to be like a huge greenhouse? Are you crazy? In the middle of London? It'll get smashed to smithereens. The working classes will just attack it." Crazy idea. But we all know that it worked. It was based on Paxton's huge greenhouses at Chatsworth. Prince had seen those greenhouses and thought that would work. So the Crystal Palace, crystal because it was glass, appeared in Hyde Park, and there were lots and lots of people saying continuing to say, this is absolutely crazy. Has the Prince gone completely mad? Why didn't somebody stop him? Before this was developed. This is just a stupid idea. Not at all. They built it over the trees. Somebody said, "Oh, you're going to chop the trees down?" No, we're going to have the trees as part of the exhibition. Oh. What about the birds that nest in the trees, and what about all the droppings? And so they consulted the great Duke of Wellington, who was the go-to guy for anything that people couldn't work out for themselves. And he is supposed to have said, he's a man of few words, a real army man of few words, what should we do about the sparrows that are sort of nesting and roosting in the trees? They'll be pulling on everybody. And he is supposed to have said, try sparrow hawks. Mom. Which, if he did say, was actually very sensible, because they did manage to get rid of the sparrows so that they weren't pulling on the visitors. And as we probably all know, the 1851 called the Great Exhibition was a runaway success, absolutely amazing success, despite all the people saying, "Oh, it'll be a disaster. The working classes are going to be allowed to go. We know how violent they are. They'll arrive all drunk. They'll break the glass. They'll break the exhibits. They'll steal things. They are not to be trusted. They are hooligans and ne'er-do-wells." Whose ridiculous idea was it to let the working classes in with a reduced entry fee? Whose daft idea was that? Well, it was the prince's idea. Again, that's the way he'd been brought up. That this should be for all the people, anybody who wanted to go, encouraged to go. And he was justified. There wasn't any damage, nothing got stolen. To everyone's amazement, well, to everyone's amazement, but to many people's amazement, the working classes did turn up in droves and behaved themselves perfectly. They were, and that was a revelation to a lot of people who didn't know any working class people. The only working class people they ever encountered were their house servants. But they heard about the working classes and how awful these people were who lived in the slums. They were no better than the pigs that they brought with them from Ireland. Horrible, horrible class divisions in those days, and the most awful prejudice against working class people. That they were violent and untrustworthy. Well, they proved themselves to be the opposite. So that was excellent. And also the idea that it would lose money. The naysayers have been saying all along, this is just a crazy, ridiculous idea, and it will lose millions of pounds. Far from it. Made a huge profit and was incredibly popular. And it started the idea of excursions. Thomas Cook ran the first excursion in this country, not overseas obviously, was to the Great Exhibition. The idea of filling a coach, people all going to the same place. That was a very new idea, and it was very successful. And that's where the idea of excursions, coach parties, that's where it originated. The Queen was absolutely beside herself with excitement on the day that the Great Exhibition was opened, and Martin's found a picture of it. Appendix 2. Criticism again that the Queen, knowing that her husband was going to be wearing a guard's uniform, bright red jacket, and that other people in attendance would be wearing bright red jackets, she decided to wear a rather startling shade of pink. People thought, why didn't she show more judgment? What they didn't know was that by this time, the prince was choosing the Queen's clothes. Quite ironic when you think she'd been controlled all those years. Her mother had chosen her clothes, and now she was submitting to her husband's judgment about clothes, which was good. He did choose some very bizarre outfits for her, and that just seems a bit weird, a bit ironic that she was now accepting her husband's decisions and accepting, if he said wear a pink dress, she wore a pink dress. It has survived actually, and it is quite strange. It's faded, but it was quite a startling shade of pink, and it had things that looked a bit like it was rolled silk, but they looked like sausages, kind of trimming. The daughter and I went to see the dresses. A lot of Queen Victoria's dresses have survived, and this in particular had an American couple behind us sort of going on and on about, what on earth, what's that trimming? What on earth? Who thought that would look nice? Well, the Queen and the Prince thought it would look nice. But the Queen was absolutely beside herself with pride on that day, having taken some of the children, and she couldn't believe how wonderful it was, and how proud she felt of the Prince for all the efforts he made. She knew how hard he'd worked and how successful it all was. I'm just trying to find the description, but I'm not finding the description. Yes, absolutely filled with pride and delight at how successful it all was. And of course, we know that, again, the prince had the idea that if it did make the profit, and he was convinced it would, and it did, made a huge profit, that the money would be used to further the education of Londoners and of the visitors to London. He was virtually on his own in promoting the idea of the museums in South Kensington, now called Museum Land. So that was his idea, because he was very, very, very concerned about education and further education and continuing lifelong learning. He would have been a great supporter of the UVA, no doubt, if he'd known about the UVA, or he might have even started the UVA in this country, or the equivalent, because that's something he believed in profoundly, that education should never stop, go on learning, go on developing, and that's why the museums are so important, and that they should be free. Very, very, that was a strange idea to a lot of the politicians. No, you shouldn't make people pay. Well, why would you make people pay if they're working class? They probably wouldn't be able to afford to keep going around museums and paying, especially if you've got children with them. Free, which again was a quite dramatic idea, a new idea, to let people in for nothing. And again, very, very successful. And the Imperial College was built with the proceeds from the the Albert Hall. The prince believed, it was a very German idea, that people should go to concerts and should learn about good music, should be able to listen to concerts. Not this class divide, which was very powerful in this country and still operates. You know, the working class people don't go to the opera, they don't go to the ballet, they don't go to sort of serious plays. There's still that attitude that is not for the likes of, and working class people will sometimes say that, well, it's not for the likes of us, it's for snobs. Well, the prince would have been appalled by people saying that. He worked hard to get away from that attitude, that there were certain people who could understand opera and certain people who it was just a wasted on them. So, what was contribution he made in his short life? I say he died when he was 42, and he had to overcome a lot of prejudice, which was simply based on the fact that he was German, the fact that he was foreign. He's better than being French, a lot better than being French, or you know, if you've got to choose a foreign, they were good because they were Protestants and they weren't in any shape, manner, or form a danger, because Germany wasn't united then. It was a lot of little tiny states. I say some of them no larger than Warwickshire, little tiny states. So there was no suggestion of war against Germany. Germany was not a united country until 1871, long after the prince had died. So it wasn't that he was seen as a power threat. It was just people didn't like foreigners. It was just prejudice against people who are foreign. A great deal to overcome this prejudice and superstition. So a massive contribution made by a single person. Now, what people didn't realise was that he was sort of wearing himself out, not just working incredibly hard on the Queen's behalf. He'd always had sort of what we used to be called a delicate constitution. We used to talk about children being delicate, which covered a multitude of sins. You didn't quite know what was meant by delicate. He'd always suffered from insomnia. He was a light sleeper. When he got, I mean, he was, say, 42 when he died, but he was already from chronic rheumatism. He had stomach pains, which of course they couldn't do x-rays in those days. They couldn't do scans. They really couldn't diagnose. If somebody said they've got pains, they couldn't even diagnose appendicitis. people often died of peritonitis because these pains they were having, they weren't diagnosed properly. So it had these stomach pains from being quite little. Neuralgia, headaches, toothache. I didn't include toothache, but he had toothache quite a lot. Sadly, the Queen was never very sympathetic. She was quite brusque about his illnesses. She thought he was whinging and whining, and which again was ironic because she made a huge fuss of everything that was wrong. If ever anything was wrong with her, and it was usually very, very minor, she made a huge fuss about it. But she didn't have much sympathy with other people who were ill. She didn't have much sympathy with Albert. She complained to her daughter. Again, we've got all this wonderful primary source material because she was a letter writer, and she wrote to her daughter sometimes 3 times a day. Like even day, she wrote to Germany when her daughter got married at 18. She had this massive correspondence with her daughter, and actually complained about dearest papa says he's ill again, in a very scathing way, as if to say, well, he's imagining it, not being ill at all. But the prince he did have all sorts of illnesses, and was constantly worried about the Queen. She didn't seem to realise part of it was worrying about her state of mind. And what she didn't know was that her doctors, her physicians, had actually spoken to the prince and said, we're worried about her mind. We're worried about the fact that she frets about everything, even little things. She didn't have much balance in her what she worried about. She interfered with. If they went for a picnic, she would find fault with what they put in the sandwiches, or she'd worry about insects, or she'd worry about the children getting dirty playing and getting their clothes dirty. She fretted and worried and interfered all the time. And still had these occasional rages. She just completely lost it. Saw red. Had a very temper. She found it very hard to control her temper. And the prince, who was incredibly calm, didn't seem to have a temper at all. Very calm and rational and sensible. Was tasked by her physicians with keeping her calm. Well, that was really went against her nature. She wasn't a calm person. Temperamentally, she didn't hardly knew what calm meant. He was thought to encourage her painting when they were in Osborne or in Balmoral, up in Balmoral. Painting rested her. She found that therapeutic. Playing the piano. She was quite musical, but he played the piano. He played the organ, soothed her. He was almost given the task of being her carer, because there was fear for her sanity. Now, of course, she didn't know that. She didn't know that the physicians were worried about her sanity. They were frightened that she looked so much like her grandfather. She looked so much like George III. They were worried that she was going to go along the same road and become deranged. Because there were times when she seemed deranged, when she lost her temper and shouted things that were really rather ridiculous. So he was told he'd got to keep her calm, and he described this once to his brother, that he was like a cat watching a mouse hole, that he had to be so diligent, watching every situation and trying to talk her down or calm her down or change the subject in some way so that she didn't get all agitated and worked up and angry and distraught. Even things like if she didn't hear from her daughter, she'd written 3 times a day, and then her daughter didn't reply immediately by the next post, she started to fret about it. Oh, something must have happened. They must be ill. She admitted that in the next letter. Oh, why didn't you write? I got myself into such a state. I thought something had happened. She lived on her nerves, and she called it being nervous. And she didn't mean nervous like afraid, nervous. She meant upset. She got upset very, very easily. And in 1861, following a visit to their naughty son in Cambridge, Prince Albert Edward, Bertie had got himself into trouble with an actress. He slept naughtily, lost his virginity to a young lady who was no better than she should be. We'll do that next time. And the prince caught a cold, and it developed into a fever, and that developed into something much worse. But we don't actually know what he died of. The death certificate said typhoid fever. The news was kept from the Queen because she got so agitated, and the physicians knew that she couldn't cope with the news. She couldn't cope with the truth. So the poor Queen had been deceived, really, by the physicians, saying, "Oh, he's making a good recovery. He's going to be better soon. He's eating better. He's sleeping better." He wasn't. He died. They think now, with the evidence that's available, that he probably had stomach cancer, and they've had it for quite a time. He's been complaining about severe pain, and say there's no way of investigating. Following his death, the Queen had what we now call, well, it's old-fashioned now actually, but to say a nervous breakdown. She collapsed, and the poor Queen was absolutely devastated. It wasn't just that she'd lost the love of her life; she'd lost his support, and she didn't know how she was going to cope. So December 1861, she became a widow, and as we all know, she wore black for the rest of her life. She mourned him for the rest of her life. And his picture, you can see Martin's found the picture of, she's with her two of her daughters. Prince Albert's picture was in every room, and she talked to it. That's why people thought she had gone mad. She talked to the picture, and it was included in most of the family photographs for some years to come, that there was either a bust of Prince Albert or a picture of him, and the Queen staring at it mournfully, emphasising how devastated she was, how her life had been ruined by his early death. Martin found this famous picture of the Queen smiling, running out of time. Famous picture of the Queen smiling. It doesn't mean she didn't smile. She's got this reputation of being very, very serious. She wasn't actually. She didn't have a sense of humour, like she couldn't tell jokes or say witty things, but she did respond to other people being funny, and she had a sense of the ridiculous. She certainly had a sense of the ridiculous, and would laugh and giggle until she cried laughing. She actually did have a sense of humour. It perhaps wasn't like everybody else's sense of humour, but she certainly found, before she lost her husband, she found life funny on many occasions. And they shared a sense of humour. They would laugh about something afterwards. It wasn't that funny when such and such a thing happened. The other reason is that photography, when it's first invented, was very, very slow. So you had to have a development time, or an exposure time of 4 minutes. I know we mentioned this before. You can't hold a smile for 4 minutes. Your face goes into rictus. It starts to twitch, and well, you just can't. You try it sometime. Try smiling for 4 minutes. It's impossible. So they didn't catch people smiling because the photographs had to be, you had to pose and stay very, very still. There are some pictures of the Queen where she's shaking so much. Actually, at her daughter's wedding, she was trembling so much with emotion that she's come out all blurred. You can hardly see her. There's this outline of the Queen, and she said in her diary she was so emotional that her daughter was getting married that she was shaking all over and shook all the way through the service. That's how sort of, not neurotic, but how emotional she was. So this last picture, she was a very old lady by the time this picture was taken, but what a transformation. The Queen smiling broadly, and that's why it's famous, because it does show her in a totally different light from this grumpy person that we associate with Queen Victoria. Black dress, dumpy figure, upside down mouth, looking cross looking angry all the time, looking discontented. Not at all. She did actually relax, and in later life, often what we'd say now, fell about laughing. So next time, I'll give you some examples of what made her laugh. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Bye.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Sorry about the jumpy picture. We'll see if we can sort it by next time. Hope it didn't disturb you too much. And we'll meet again in a fortnight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Martin.
Martin, can you give me the reference for going on to the
If I saw him on the street, I wouldn't recognise.
YouTube?
Oh, yes. If you go on to YouTube and just put English, U3A English History,
Thank you.
What's the code for it?
it'll come up just with those words.
All right, English
U3A
history.
History.
Thank you, Martin.